Well, hello everybody. We're going to talk about one of my favorite things, the idiotic idea that Bitcoin is perfect as it is. There's nothing we can do to improve it, so just leave it alone. Oh, how did that get in there? The biggest cheerleader for this complete stupidity in how to approach things. But I want to start off just kind of going through a thought experiment of where would we be if Bitcoin had ossified in 2014. We wouldn't have Lightning Network. We wouldn't have state chains. We wouldn't have ARC. We wouldn't have BitVM, because none of the big problems that enabled all of these things, the solutions wouldn't be there. Transaction malleability made it completely impossible to build any type of system based on pre-signed transactions, because any person could just manipulate the signature or the input stack items and completely change the transaction ID. And the way Bitcoin works, every time you go to spend a coin, you are literally pointing backwards at the transaction ID of the last transaction to create that coin. So if somebody can change that while it's in the mempool before it's confirmed, it invalidates every pre-signed transaction in the future that's based on spending that. We would have no script level time locks. The original version of Bitcoin, the only form of time lock was the unlock time field in the transaction itself. So you could pre-sign a transaction and make that transaction guaranteed to be unusable until some time in the future, but you couldn't time lock anything at the script level, actually having the UTXO enforce that. And because of these two things, we couldn't do HTLCs. You couldn't even really do payment channels. This is what we would have. We would have multi-sig, we would have hash locks, and we would have the ability to make pre-signed transactions that any person just watching them move around the network could manipulate. So we could only really do one transaction. We couldn't add layers or multiples of them chained together. And even the basic type of payment channel we have, it'd be a crapshoot. We would essentially make the pre-signed transaction, load the multi-sig, and then pray that nobody fucked with it. And if they did, well, if both people involved in that payment channel don't cooperate, that money is burned forever. Both people have to sign, the pre-signed transaction is invalidated, so if they don't cooperate, it's done. Like, you would have to be pretty much only opening payment channels with people you trust, which kind of defeats the whole point of things like that. And then federations and custodians. And these would be the only things that we have available to actually scale Bitcoin or make this work in any serious way. Payment channels also would be one way, because we don't have the time locks necessary in script level to have these enforcement periods that Lightning has, where if somebody uses an old version of the channel state, we can penalize them, we can enforce the correct outcome. So to have anything resembling a routable payment network, as opposed to just you open a direct channel to whoever you're transacting with every time you're transacting with somebody new, you would have to have two completely separate channels to be able to send and receive. And once those are depleted, there is no way to balance them. You have to close that channel and open a completely new one. And there is no way around that. Federated systems, conventional multisig had a maximum limit of 15 participants. Now with Taproot and Schnorr, we could have hundreds or thousands of people if you get them together to coordinate in a single multisig. Like, that actually kind of changes things significantly when looking at the trust model of federated systems. Like, they can be very large, very inclusive, and not this small group of people that could practically collude. That wouldn't be possible, because the biggest thing we would have is that 15 and 15 multisig. And doing the type of multi-party computation tricks that we do with Schnorr to have multi-sig that produces one signature is possible with ECDSA signatures and the old system, but it's a lot more complex and a lot more dangerous. And frankly, every big implementation of that, lots of custodians like Fireblocks have produced these schemes just to be able to do multi-sig threshold custody for all the different shitcoins out there. They've been riddled with security flaws. There have been exploits that were discovered. It's nowhere near as simple to prove security as it is with Schnorr. And then obviously, custodians. Say hello to Coinbase. That's where 99% of people are gonna wind up. And this would be the state of things if Bitcoin just froze in 2014 and we said, this is perfect. We don't need to improve anything. This is good enough. And so, oh, there he is again. See, you can't improve digital energy. But let's look at the current state of things now. So we do have Lightning, but the reality is the liquidity limitations are very difficult to deal with. The reality from my point of view is Lightning is working very well in the interior of the network. Like well-connected nodes are functional, payments are being routed, but when you look at the edges, like the end users, those liquidity issues become very hard to manage. And it's kind of undeniable at this point, the vast majority of people who actually use Lightning transactionally do so with custodians because of all of these issues. And that's the only way right now to really smooth them over for most non-technical users. And you can't just expect everyone to become a technical power user if we want this to actually become a global protocol. The on-chain scalability, this is something people kind of like to gloss over and ignore, but routing small payments over Lightning will not be trustless in the long term. To actually be able to enforce a payment during a channel stalling out that hadn't finalized yet, you have to submit that on chain. If the fee to actually get that on chain is higher than the value of the payment, it makes no economic sense to do that. So this is a big looming problem. Like, how are we going to handle that? Lightning will be good for settling large value payments trustlessly, but your average purchases, they won't be trustless. And then the state loss risk. If you lose your most recent channel state, you're kind of screwed unless your channel counterparty cooperates with you, because everything you have at that point just gives them the ability to steal all of your funds because it's an old revoked state. And we look at state chains, ARC, BitVM. ARC and BitVM also have liquidity issues in a different way that just require a lot of capital up front from somebody for the system to work in the first place. State chains, if you're not very familiar, just high-level problem, you can only transfer a state chain a certain number of times because you have a time lock going in reverse each transfer to guarantee that only the current owner can actually enforce that and claim those coins on chain. So what do we need? For Lightning, we need LN symmetry, or L2. We need something that allows a user to fuck up in a way. And even if they do use an old state, have their channel counterparty possess a mechanism to, instead of stealing their money, just replace it with the correct one. So that if somebody screws up, they're not going to lose all of their money, the other person will just fix it and everyone will get the correct amount of money they need. And we need channel factories. We need a way to essentially take the conventional two-person Lightning channel and pack hundreds of these into a single UTXO on chain so that we can actually afford to onboard large numbers of people in the event that we actually get to a point that many people want to use Bitcoin in a self-custodial way. State chain can also benefit from LN symmetry or L2. That allows you to remove the transfer limit. So a state chain could now be transferred an unlimited amount of times off chain rather than kind of counting down, and when you hit 0, whoever has it then has to close it out on chain. Arc, one of the biggest problems of Arc is the interactivity. Like, it's possible to build right now. There are 2 companies in this space building it, but 100% of the users in an Arc when it's created have to be online and have to sign the transactions that actually create the Arc. If we had a covenant proposal like CTV or a transaction hash, you don't need that interactivity anymore. The service provider can just make the transaction that creates this Arc with funds for everybody, and once it's confirmed, it's consensus enforced that the money goes where it's supposed to. And then BitVM could also benefit from transaction hash or CAT for the exact same reasons. Not having to have everybody instantiating a BitVM cooperate and coordinate pre-signing these transactions. You just create the covenant template, fund it, and it's going to enforce the same thing that the pre-signed transactions would. So all of these things kind of add up to these main features. The one I didn't touch on in the last slide is any ordered exit from a channel factory. So the big problem with something like that, trying to pack hundreds of individual Lightning channels on top of a single UTXO, is that creates a tree. Like, essentially, you have the UTXO on chain, and then transactions that break that up into 4 or 5 UTXOs. And then each of those have transactions that do the same, until you have the whole tree with the 2-party Lightning channels on top. So if anybody wants to leave this channel, they kind of start breaking it apart and damaging the utility for everybody involved in it. The whole idea of this is that if you're in a channel factory with somebody, you can off-chain open or close the 2-party Lightning channels. But if somebody wants to or has to exit and enforce anything on chain, the whole factory just starts kind of coming apart. So we need covenants that essentially allow us to take one person and their channel out of a channel factory and just put everyone else back into it in a single transaction, so that you don't have this fragmentation anytime anything needs to be enforced on chain. That also requires rebindable transactions, or L2, like the ability to attach a pre-signed transaction not to a specific transaction ID, but to the script, so that any coin that has the specified script and the appropriate amount, that transaction could attach to it, regardless of what the transaction ID is. And so these 2 things together allow us to kind of solve that problem of, I want out of the channel factory, well, I start breaking it for everybody else. Checksig from Stack allows some interesting things when it comes to time locks. You can essentially give each user, in the case of something like a state chain, a different time lock value that is not specified in the script. You just have a signature from that person and an op that says a piece of data is going to get put on the stack here. Make sure it was signed by this key, and if it was, then it continues evaluating the script. So you can create a variant of state chains where instead of having a hard time limit, where like by this day, this state chain has to close, you just make it this number of transfers and the time doesn't matter. You're just using a relative time lock to sideload this value that's unique for each person. So you can kind of change the lifetime that's possible with that. And then obviously CAT, you can have all kinds of fun and games manipulating items on the stack and just doing probably a bunch of stupid, but a lot of useful stuff manipulating scripts. There he is again. Developers don't need to maintain software. That's not how this works, right? But yeah, pretty much ossification is inevitable. It's the result of this getting bigger, people disagreeing on things, and the system becoming too complicated to actually agree on anything going forward. We shouldn't be trying to accelerate this though. Bitcoin is nowhere near where it needs to be to actually serve a global population in a self-custodial way. So while this is an inescapable reality, we shouldn't be pushing for it, accelerating it. We should be fighting against it as long as we can. And so, yeah, we only have one chance, so let's not fuck this up. And I guess a last comment along the lines of developments, I'd like to just give a nod to Scalar School, a development school for female developers looking to get into Bitcoin down here in Brazil. We need a lot more groups and projects like that because there is a lot of shit to build and a lot of stupidity to explain to the idiots out there. So thank you for listening, everybody.